90%. That single number is the only number you need to understand why one small strip of coral, barely 5 miles long, sitting 15 miles off the coast of Iran in the Persian Gulf, became the most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet in March of 2026. 90% of all Iranian crude oil exports flow through Kharg Island. Not some of it. Not most of it. 90%. Every barrel that keeps the Islamic Republic of Iran alive economically passes through that island, gets loaded onto tankers, and sails south through the Strait of Hormuz into the world's energy markets. And on the night of March 13, 2026, the United States Central Command executed what Donald Trump called, in his own words posted to Truth Social, one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. More than 90 Iranian military targets on that island were struck simultaneously and obliterated in a single night. Naval mine storage facilities were gone. Missile storage bunkers were gone. Every military installation that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had spent decades building on that island was erased. And here is what made it even more stunning. Trump deliberately left the oil infrastructure standing. He spared the tanker terminals. He spared the pipelines. He spared the processing facilities. Because he wanted Iran to understand something. He was not destroying their wealth yet. He was destroying their ability to defend it. And that distinction, that very specific and calculated act of restraint wrapped in overwhelming violence, was the message that changed everything. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back much further than March 2026. You have to understand the years of calculation, miscalculation, bluff, counterbluff, and strategic maneuvering that brought two countries to the edge of a catastrophe that reshaped the entire Middle East. And you have to understand something about Donald Trump that his opponents have consistently and fatally underestimated. The man has been thinking about Kharg Island for nearly 40 years. This is not an exaggeration. In 1988, decades before he ever sat in the Oval Office, Trump was already talking publicly about Kharg Island. He told anyone who would listen that if one American was shot, he would do a number on Kharg Island. He said it plainly. He said it as a private businessman with no power to act on it. That was the year the United States was engaged in Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval engagement since World War II, fighting Iranian gunboats in the Persian Gulf. Everyone else was focused on the tactical naval battle unfolding in real time. Trump was already looking past the immediate conflict and naming the one strategic target that would determine the long-term outcome. And then he spent the next 4 decades watching presidents come and go, watching Iran accumulate power, watching the nuclear program expand, watching the proxy wars spread across the region, and waiting for the moment when he would be in a position to actually do what he had always said he would do. The patience of that is remarkable. The strategic consistency is even more remarkable, because most politicians change their views when the political winds shift, when constituencies change, when the geopolitical landscape rearranges itself and old certainties become liabilities. Trump never changed his view on this. The target he identified in 1988 as a private citizen is the same target he struck as president in 2026. The immediate sequence of events that led to the Kharg Island strike began with what appeared on the surface to be a diplomatic breakthrough. In the weeks leading up to February 28, 2026, American and Iranian negotiators were meeting in Geneva under the mediation of Omani officials, discussing what both sides described as productive negotiations toward a new nuclear deal. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action had long since collapsed, killed first by Trump in his first term and then by Iranian violations and American counterpressures. Now, in early 2026, there was a real possibility of something new. Talks were happening, language was being exchanged. Both sides were publicly talking about a framework. And then, on February 17th and 18th, while those very talks were still ongoing in Geneva, Iran did something that, in retrospect, reveals exactly what kind of game they thought they were playing. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced the temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz for live-fire military drills. They conducted those drills in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. This was a direct show of force, timed to coincide with the nuclear negotiations, designed to communicate to the United States that Iran held a card that could not be ignored. The message from Tehran was unmistakable. We are negotiating. But we are negotiating from a position of strength, and at any moment we can cut off 20% of the world's oil supply. This was the miscalculation. Not the drills themselves, but the belief that this kind of coercive signaling would make Trump more flexible at the table, rather than more determined to make the table irrelevant. Iran's leadership, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, had spent years developing a theory of deterrence against the United States that was built around the Strait of Hormuz. The thinking was this: the world depends on oil flowing through that strait. If Iran threatens to close it, or actually closes it, the resulting economic shock to global markets would create enough political pressure on any American administration to back down. It had worked before, or at least appeared to work before, because previous administrations had been sensitive to global economic consequences in ways that constrained their willingness to use military force. President Obama calculated that the risk of military escalation against Iran was not worth the uncertain benefits. President Biden sought to revive diplomacy and treated Iranian nuclear enrichment as something to manage through incentives rather than destroy through force. Even Trump himself, in his first term, pulled back from strikes on Iranian territory after an American drone was shot down, citing in real time the projected Iranian casualty count. Iran read all of that history and drew an entirely rational but ultimately fatal conclusion. The United States would always blink before crossing the line into truly devastating military action against the Islamic Republic. They thought the economic interdependencies of the global oil market served as an invisible veto over American military adventurism. They thought they had constructed an unbreakable deterrence architecture around that veto. They thought Trump would be the same. They were wrong in a way they never recovered from. On February 26, 2026, 2 days after the most recent round of Geneva talks concluded with what Omani mediators described as promising progress, the decision was made in Washington and Jerusalem. On February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury began. It was one of the largest coordinated military operations since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Nearly 900 strikes were launched in the first 12 hours alone. The targets were Iranian missile batteries, air defense systems, military infrastructure, command and control centers, and leadership. The operation killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei on the first day. It killed roughly 49 senior regime and military officials in the opening phase. It targeted the nuclear program directly, hitting Natanz, Fordo, and associated facilities. Trump went before cameras and declared that Iran's plans to dominate the region and destroy Israel were now dead. He said, just like Iran itself, those plans are now dead. Iran's response was immediate and massive. The Revolutionary Guard launched retaliatory strikes against Israel, against American bases in Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Iran-backed Hezbollah opened a second front against Israel from Lebanon. And then Iran did the thing they had always threatened to do. They closed the Strait of Hormuz, not for drills this time, for real. On March 2nd, 2026, the IRGC officially confirmed that the strait was closed to unfriendly nations. Iranian warships and fast boats moved to enforce it. They warned vessels in the strait by radio that no ship was allowed to pass. Tanker traffic collapsed almost immediately. The global energy shock that Iran had been threatening for years suddenly became real, and the consequences rippled through every economy on Earth. Here is where you need to understand the strategic geometry of what Iran thought it had accomplished. By closing the Strait of Hormuz, Iran believed it had put Trump in an impossible position. If Trump used military force to reopen the strait, he risked further escalation and potential attacks on American assets throughout the region. If he backed down and allowed the strait to remain closed, he would face catastrophic economic pressure domestically and internationally. If he tried to negotiate while the strait was closed, he would be negotiating with a gun to the world's head, which meant Iran would hold all the leverage. In Tehran's calculation, they had neutralized Trump's military advantage by creating a situation where using that advantage would cause more damage than absorbing it. They thought they had found the one pressure point that would make the most aggressive American president in modern history hesitate. What they did not account for was Kharg Island. They did not account for the fact that Trump was thinking about the problem in a completely different frame. While Iran was looking at the Strait of Hormuz as its weapon, Trump was looking at Kharg Island as their vulnerability. And the specific logic of this is worth examining carefully because it reveals a level of strategic sophistication that often gets lost in the noise of Trump's public persona. The Strait of Hormuz is a geographic feature that Iran can threaten but does not fully control. Reopening it by force requires a sustained naval and air campaign against Iranian vessels and shore-based missile batteries. It is achievable, but costly and visible. Kharg Island, on the other hand, is a piece of land. It is Iran's irreplaceable economic infrastructure concentrated in a single location that cannot be moved, cannot be hidden, and cannot be defended against American air power. It is the one target where a strike produces immediate, enormous, and permanent economic consequences for Iran without necessarily requiring boots on the ground or a prolonged naval battle. Kharg Island is Iran's economic heart, and Trump had been thinking about cutting it out for 38 years. The 2 weeks between the start of Operation Epic Fury and the strike on Kharg Island on March 13th were a period of escalating pressure that has rarely been studied with the seriousness it deserves. While the world was focused on the strait closure and the humanitarian dimensions of the conflict, Trump was engaged in a methodical campaign to give Iran every possible off-ramp before he pulled the trigger on the one thing they could not survive. He issued ultimatums about the strait. He threatened specific infrastructure targets. He said publicly that he wanted Iran to open the strait before he had to make a decision he did not want to make, and he was not bluffing. Every statement Trump made during that period was calibrated to create exactly one possible Iranian response: stop closing the strait and come to the table on American terms. Iran's new leadership, scrambling to establish authority after the death of Khamenei, kept refusing. They kept threatening. They kept escalating. And they kept believing that the global economic consequences of a Kharg Island strike would deter Trump from pulling the trigger. On March 13th, 2026, day 14 of the conflict, Trump authorized Central Command to execute the strike. What happened that night was not a limited punitive action. It was comprehensive military destruction of every Iranian military capability on the island. More than 90 targets were hit simultaneously by precision munitions. Naval mine storage facilities were destroyed, which removed Iran's ability to lay mines in the shipping lanes around the island. Missile storage bunkers were destroyed, which removed Iran's ability to threaten tankers approaching or departing the terminal. Multiple radar installations, command and control nodes, barracks, and naval assets were obliterated. The United States Air Force used joint direct attack munitions loaded onto B-1 Lancer bombers operating out of RAF Fairford in southwest England, among other platforms. The video that Trump posted to Truth Social, later geolocated by CNN, showed massive explosions and black smoke rising from the island's airport facilities. When CENTCOM released its after-action statement the next morning, it confirmed that U.S. forces had successfully struck more than 90 Iranian military targets on Kharg Island while preserving the oil infrastructure. That phrase deserves to be read slowly. While preserving the oil infrastructure, Trump did not destroy Iran's ability to export oil on March 13th. He destroyed Iran's ability to defend Kharg Island from the next strike. The sequencing here is the key to understanding the entire strategic logic. First, you eliminate their defenses. Then you hold their economic survival hostage. Then you make your demand clear. Trump's demand was unambiguous. Stop closing the Strait of Hormuz, or I will reconsider my decision not to hit the oil infrastructure. He said it in those exact terms in his Truth Social post after the strike. He said, "For reasons of decency, I have chosen not to wipe out the oil infrastructure on the island. However, should Iran or anyone else do anything to interfere with the free and safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, I will immediately reconsider this decision." That is not a bluff. That is a man who just proved he would strike Kharg Island, telling you what happens next if you do not comply. And everyone in Tehran understood that. They understood it because they could see the smoke still rising from their own island on the satellite images. The aftermath of the March 13th strike tells you everything about the effectiveness of the approach. Iran vowed retaliation, as it always does. Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf warned that if Tehran's infrastructure was targeted, key facilities across the region could be irreversibly destroyed. The IRGC issued statements promising consequences. Iranian state media, citing local sources, initially reported that most of the oil transport hub's infrastructure remained intact, which was technically accurate because the United States had deliberately spared it. But that was precisely the point. Iran's communications apparatus was trying to spin the story as a limited American action that fell short of its maximum objectives. In doing so, they were inadvertently confirming the terror of the actual message. The oil infrastructure was not hit this time. Vice President J.D. Vance went on television and said the strikes did not mark a change in strategy. That statement was carefully worded. It did not say there would be no further strikes. It said there was no change in strategy. The strategy was always that the oil infrastructure remained as the next card in the deck. But here is what actually happened on the ground. In the days after the strike, negotiations intensified dramatically. The highest level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Iranian Revolution occurred just a few weeks later in Islamabad, Pakistan, between Vice President J.D. Vance and Ghalibaf himself. Two countries that had not spoken directly at that level in nearly half a century were suddenly sitting across from each other in a room trying to figure out how to end a war. That happened because of Kharg Island. The strike did not end the conflict overnight, but it fundamentally altered the balance of leverage that both sides brought to any negotiation. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful analysis, because the simplistic narrative is that Trump hit Kharg Island and Iran caved. The reality is more complicated and more interesting. Iran's leadership structure after Khamenei's death was in genuine chaos. A new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, had been installed. The elected president, Mahmoud Pezeshkian, was trying to navigate between hardliners who wanted continued resistance and pragmatists who recognized that the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. The country was under a naval blockade that Trump ordered in April 2026. Its air defenses had been significantly degraded. Its nuclear program had been struck. Its most important proxy, Hezbollah, was under intense pressure in Lebanon from Israeli operations. And now Kharg Island, the one piece of infrastructure that generated the revenue to fund all of these activities, sat stripped of its military defenses, with Trump's finger hovering over the button to destroy the oil terminals themselves. Iran had three conditions that its president stated publicly for ending the conflict: firm guarantees against future aggression, recognition of Iran's legitimate rights, and payment of reparations. These were maximalist demands that reflected the political pressures inside Iran more than any realistic assessment of their negotiating position. But even Iran understood that the ground had shifted. When Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire in April 2026, Iranian officials confirmed it. When J.D. Vance sat down with Iranian officials in Islamabad on April 11th and 12th, Iran came to the table not as a country that had broken Trump, but as a country that was trying to survive a military and economic campaign that threatened the regime's survival. The broader geopolitical significance of what happened at Kharg Island extends well beyond the U.S.-Iran bilateral relationship. For decades, the entire deterrence theory of smaller regional powers against the United States was built around the asymmetric threat of choke point denial. The argument was that any country sitting astride a critical shipping lane or oil transit route could neutralize American military superiority by threatening consequences that the global economy could not absorb. The Strait of Hormuz was the ultimate expression of this theory. It was Iran's insurance policy. It was the reason that multiple American administrations going back to the 1980s had been reluctant to take the kind of direct military action against Iran that they were willing to take against other adversaries. The implicit understanding was that if you hit Iran hard enough to make them feel genuinely threatened, they would close the strait, and the resulting economic catastrophe would be worse than whatever you were trying to prevent. The Kharg Island strike, combined with the sustained military campaign of Operation Epic Fury and the subsequent blockade of the strait by the United States Navy, demonstrated that this deterrence theory had a fundamental flaw. It assumed that the cost of closing the strait fell entirely on the United States and its allies, and that Iran bore no commensurate cost. But if you first destroy Iran's military capacity to defend its key oil infrastructure and then tell Iran that you will destroy that infrastructure if the strait remains closed, the calculus inverts completely. Now, Iran is the party facing an existential economic threat, not just the world's oil markets. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz costs Iran something too. It cost them American restraint toward Kharg Island. And once that became real on March 13, 2026, the theoretical deterrence framework that Iran had built its entire regional strategy around began to crack. The global economic dimensions of this period were severe and cannot be understated. The Strait of Hormuz carries somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. When Iran closed it on February 28th, and the IRGC began enforcing that closure with attacks on vessels, tanker traffic collapsed. Fuel shortages rippled through parts of Asia within weeks. Global oil prices spiked. Shipping insurance rates became prohibitive. Countries that depended on Gulf oil, including Japan, South Korea, India, and China, faced supply disruptions that created enormous political pressure on their governments to push for a resolution. The United States, which under Trump's energy policy had dramatically expanded domestic production, was insulated from some of these pressures, but the global economic shock still created significant headwinds. It was, as military strategists had long feared, a genuinely catastrophic disruption to the world energy system. And yet Trump did not blink. He held the line. He struck Kharg Island. He threatened the oil infrastructure. He blockaded the strait with the U.S. Navy. He imposed costs on Iran that no previous American president had been willing to impose, and he did it while managing the political fallout with the kind of blunt communication that either alarmed or galvanized, depending on your perspective. He told Iran that a whole civilization will die tonight if they did not make a deal by his deadline. He posted AI-generated images of warplanes striking Kharg Island on Truth Social. He said he might hit the island a few more times just for fun. These statements were widely criticized as reckless and destabilizing, and there is a legitimate debate about the diplomatic costs of that kind of language. But they also served a purpose. They made Iran's leadership believe correctly that Trump was genuinely willing to cross lines that his predecessors had not crossed. And that belief changed the strategic calculus in ways that no amount of careful diplomatic signaling from a more conventional president could have achieved. The ceasefire that Pakistan announced in April, the direct talks that followed, the Memorandum of Understanding signed in Switzerland in June 2026, and the subsequent collapse of that agreement as both sides resumed hostilities in July, all of this reflects the complexity of a conflict that was genuinely resolved militarily but only partially resolved politically. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, said he had a different view than President Pezeshkian on the June memorandum, but ultimately allowed it because assurances were given about Iran's interests. The MOU included Hormuz reopening within 30 days, the unfreezing of $24 billion in Iranian assets, 60 days of nuclear talks and sanctions relief. Oil prices crashed to 3-month lows on the announcement. Markets rallied globally. Then Israel bombed Beirut hours before the formal signing, and the fragile architecture of the deal began to strain immediately. The July resumption of conflict following Iranian strikes on commercial vessels in the Strait brought the situation full circle in ways that revealed both the achievement and the limits of what the Kharg Island strike accomplished. It had not ended Iran's capacity or willingness to use the Strait as a weapon. It had not produced a permanent nuclear deal. It had not resolved the fundamental strategic competition between Iran and the United States in the Middle East. What it had done was fundamentally alter the balance of psychological and military leverage going into any future negotiation. Iran now understood, not in theory but from lived experience, that the United States under Trump was willing to strike Kharg Island, that there was no longer any theoretical protection in the threat to close the strait because that threat had been called, and the costs imposed on Iran had been severe. The deterrence architecture that Iran had spent decades building had been tested and found insufficient. There is a deeper historical irony buried in this story that deserves attention. Kharg Island was previously attacked during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, struck it repeatedly in an attempt to cripple Iran's oil revenues. Those attacks were damaging, but never decisive. Iran managed to maintain significant export capacity even through sustained aerial assault. The lesson that many strategists took from that period was that Kharg Island was more resilient than it appeared, and that destroying it completely would require a sustained campaign that might not be worth the strategic costs. Trump did not appear to be looking at the same history in the same way. Or, rather, he looked at it and concluded something different. That the question was not whether to destroy the island completely, but whether to destroy its defenses first, and use the threat of destroying the oil infrastructure as leverage. That is a different approach from what Saddam tried, and it proved significantly more effective as a coercive tool. What makes this entire episode genuinely significant in the history of American foreign policy is the question of precedent. For the first time in the post-1945 international order, the United States actually struck the primary oil export infrastructure of a major regional power, cleared its defenses, and held the destruction of its economic lifeline as a hostage in active negotiations. This is a different category of action from sanctions, from proxy conflicts, from limited strikes on nuclear facilities. This is the United States saying, explicitly and with demonstrated capability, that it can and will destroy your ability to sell oil if you do not comply with our demands. The implications of that precedent extend far beyond Iran. Every country that has relied on the implicit deterrent of choke point control or economic leverage through energy is now reassessing whether that deterrent actually works against the United States under this kind of leadership. The analysis of whether this approach achieves lasting strategic goals is genuinely complex and contested. Supporters argue that it produced the first direct U.S.-Iran negotiations at the vice presidential level since 1979, forced Iran to accept a ceasefire framework, and demonstrated that American resolve can alter the behavior of adversaries who had previously treated American red lines as flexible. Critics argue that it unleashed an economic shock that cost the global economy trillions, created a humanitarian catastrophe in Iran, destroyed the possibility of a negotiated nuclear deal through diplomatic means, and set precedents for the use of force that could destabilize the international order in ways that will take decades to understand. Both of these analyses contain truth. What is undeniable is that Iran did think they had broken Trump. They thought that closing the Strait of Hormuz, shooting down an American Apache helicopter near the strait in June, killing American service members at bases across the region, and maintaining defiant public rhetoric, would force Trump into a position where he had to negotiate on their terms. They thought that the economic consequences of a full confrontation would constrain him the way they had constrained every president before him. They had spent years building a foreign policy architecture around that assumption. And on the night of March 13, 2026, 90-plus Iranian military targets on Kharg Island were destroyed in one of the most powerful bombing raids in Middle Eastern history, and the oil infrastructure was deliberately left standing as a warning about what would happen next. That was not Iran breaking Trump. That was Trump erasing the strategic premise that had made Iran believe they could break any American president at all. The story of Kharg Island is ultimately a story about the difference between what countries say they will do and what they are actually capable of doing when the test arrives. Iran had said for years that it would close the Strait of Hormuz if threatened, and it did. Trump had said for 38 years that he would do a number on Kharg Island if American interests were attacked, and he did. The difference is that Iran's action, the closure of the strait, was reversible once the costs became clear. The destruction of 90-plus military targets on Kharg Island is not reversible. Those bunkers do not come back. Those naval mine storage facilities do not come back. The military deterrent capacity that Iran had spent decades building on that island to protect the infrastructure that funds everything the regime does was erased in a single night. And that asymmetry, that one side's escalation created lasting damage while the other side's escalation remained a tool to be turned on and off, is what ultimately determined who held the leverage in every conversation that followed. The conflict, as of mid-2026, remains unresolved in the sense that a final permanent nuclear deal has not been signed. The strait has been subject to continuing tension, with ceasefire periods alternating with renewed incidents. Iran's new leadership is still finding its footing after the death of Khamenei and the profound shock of the Operation Epic Fury strikes. The political situation inside Iran is complex. Some Iranians celebrated Khamenei's death while security forces cracked down on public dissent, and the relationship between the elected president and the new supreme leader contains real tensions over how to navigate the post-war landscape. None of this is fully resolved, but Kharg Island is the fixed point around which all of it orbits. Everything that Iran does in any negotiation, every calculation that Iranian leaders make about how far to push and when to stop, is now done with the knowledge that the United States demonstrated, not threatened, but demonstrated, that it will strike Kharg Island, that it can eliminate Iran's military defenses on that island in a single night, and that the decision to destroy the oil infrastructure itself remains entirely at Trump's discretion. That is a fundamentally different strategic environment than the one Iran was operating in before March 13th, 2026. And it was created not by diplomacy, not by sanctions alone, not by proxy wars, but by a 79-year-old American president who had been telling anyone who would listen since 1988 exactly what he was going to do, and who finally had both the authority and the will to do it. The world is still accounting for what that means. The oil markets are still adjusting. The nuclear question is still open. The Strait of Hormuz is still a flashpoint that could ignite again at any moment. Iran is still Iran, but Kharg Island is different now. The defenses are gone. The military installations are rubble. The threat that was always implicit in those installations, the threat that Iran could use that island as a military base from which to protect its economic lifeline and project force into the Persian Gulf, is no longer credible. And if there is one thing that defines the moment when Iran went from believing they had broken Trump to understanding what they were actually dealing with, it is that night in March 2026, when the bombs fell on Kharg Island and the oil terminals remained standing. Not because Trump could not destroy them, but because he wanted Iran to know he was choosing not to, for now,